Hello, folks. So here's the story. By the way, Seb, why don't you just join me? Why don't you just turn on your camera? You just join me because we're trying to be very casual here. I did put on a company shirt, but that's the extent of the formality. Seb, good morning.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon for
And
you
good evening.
with
That's
us.
right, yes. So Seb and I, among others, participated in the user conference, what was it, a little over a month ago, something like that?
Yeah.
Where we were co-located at the company headquarters in Lebège, which if you attended the event, you would know was just outside of Toulouse. And all of the sessions were pre-recorded, but were surrounded by live Q&A sessions that would enable us to answer questions people were asking live. And the feedback was very good about those QA sessions. People really appreciated those. Big shocker, you might have questions and you don't want to wait a few days to get the answer. You want the answer right away. We thought that was a good thing. So that's number one. We thought that was really good, and we're making you wait once a year for a live Q&A session. That seems kind of dumb. Number two, another reason for this session that we'll do quarterly is we get good questions all the time. So forget the user conference. We have technical support in the user community, and we have one-on-one consulting sessions, and we have prospects going through the trial. We get all of these great questions, and we answer those great questions to those specific people that answered them, and nobody else benefits from the answer. And that doesn't seem fair either. And I remember years ago, when literally a decade ago, our support threads were public. So you could read other questions and read the answers, but there was a privacy aspect to it. And we don't really do that anymore. So you can't search other people's questions. So we had all this great stuff out there, and only the person asking benefits. And if more than one person asks it, we're just answering it over and over again. So people love live Q&A from the user conference. We get lots of questions throughout the year that only get answered to the specific person. We should be doing this more often, and that's how this session was born. Let us take some of the most interesting questions, the most broadly relevant questions, and answer them live so that folks who join us can participate and ask follow-up questions, and record it as well. For the user conference, we did not record live Q&A, so if you weren't there, you didn't see it. That's what we're doing today. That's what we're kicking off today. Every 3 months, once a quarter, we're going to gather the best questions we've received, and live, mainly Seb, so I'm the MC, Seb does all the hard stuff. We'll answer those questions, but I will poke and prod with additional questions. I want to get started. So just one last point, which is the usual thing about webinars. If you do have a question, please use that questions panel in the GoToWebinar toolbar. While Seb is helping answer these questions, I'm going to monitor anything you type, and we will answer those on the fly if we feel they're particularly relevant. So at any point of view of a question, you type it into the questions panel. It's the first time we've done this. We made up things on the fly a little bit. We might tweak it, but the way we're going to structure it now is you type in your questions. If there's something very relevant, I'll ask it right away. If it's something that could be interesting, but we can shelve it for later. We might even have time for sort of a lightning round where you can just ask anything you want at the end of the webinar. We might even unmute your mic, because it turns out we can do that. And that could be, you don't have to if you don't want to, but if you're interested, we can do that as well. So bear with us as we kind of air out the way we run this event. So that said, it's time to get started. We shared a preliminary agenda. We posted it to the community and on the event page. One of the most common questions we get is about scheduling content. We have a lot of people coming from the traditional digital signage world. The notion of day parting of scheduling content is very classic. Well, if I've got the headless CMS in Intuiface, how am I scheduling content so I can predetermine when things will show? Okay. Today I want something to show tomorrow. How do I schedule that sort of thing? Very common question. How do we do that with the headless CMS? Seb, that's a good question. So how would we do that with the headless CMS?
Well, first of all, you might want to make me a presenter so I can share my screen.
Yes.
That might help. So just to complete what Geoff said, all the questions we're going to talk about today, we gathered them from the user community, from the support, from the consulting sessions we've been doing with you guys, and from the user conference as well. So please do not hesitate to ask us questions about the topics we're going to address today. But also about any other topics, about any interface topics. We will have time at the end of the session to address these ones, hopefully. And You should see my screen right now. Yep, I think so. So the first topic is about scheduled content. And for those of you who attended the user conference, you might remember this sample. I'm going to reuse it, but go a bit more into the details about how it is made and how you can make this work. So first of all, we are in player here in play mode. You have a list of content here on the left, which is a collection of items to which we added a start date and an end date. So all these validity kind of topics that you want to have in classic signage where you want to schedule ahead. Okay, starting next Monday, I want this ad to air online until next Thursday or Friday. And I want this ad to be available in Paris, but not in London, etc., etc. So all these kind of combinations to schedule content during a period of time, and maybe on some devices, not on others. So here we have the unfiltered list, so all the media items which are actually in the database. And of course, if I filter them, I'm getting only the ones where today, June 28th, is between the start date and the end date. So how do we make this, and how complex it is, or not complex it is, or simple it is to build with Intuiface, and especially with the headless CMS? So first of all, I'm going to dive into the headless CMS here. I will go into our media slideshow base, and let's start with the structure first. So if you need to create a playlist of images or maybe videos or mixed media where you want these validity dates, the only thing you need to do at the structure level is to add these two fields which I have here, which you can get from the specific values, date, time. So you just add a field like this, name it start date, do it again for the end date, and all the elements that you will add within this collection, this is a collection of items, will have a start date and an end date. Besides that, you could also play with variants. So maybe an item would have a global start date and end date. So for all your locations, Paris, London, you would have all the medias, or maybe the start date you want it to be different based on the location. If that's the case, just click on the variant, select location, and I will not do it right now because I will mess my content and my demo, but that's the idea. If you want the start date and the end date maybe to be different depending on locations, just add the variant location to both these fields. That's it. So it is true, we don't have scheduling out of the box. If you create a collection in the headless CMS, you won't have these two fields, but it takes 10 seconds to add them to a collection, start date, end date. Once you have that in the structure, you can go into the content. And basically, when you add your media files, image or video, maybe here I had a label that I wanted to display on top, I just pick a date. So I have my date picker, usual stuff, and I can say this one will be valid from March 27 to March 21st, but next year. So basically, that's when it's always running, etc., etc. So that's on the backend side, on the CMS side. How do you use this information in Composer? How do you apply that filter? Let me go back to edit mode in Composer to show you how I think we can say simple it is. Here, I'm just using a button as an example because it's a bit easier to demonstrate, but obviously you would probably use a different trigger like experience started, or one which not a lot of people know, even you're not familiar with this one yet, is on the base itself, you can add a trigger sync completed. That means that the base was synchronized locally with the cloud. That happens when you launch the experience, or if regularly you want to check what's going on the server side, on the CMS. If you expect people to be able to make changes every hours, you might want to do a sync every hour. When this sync is completed, then you can call the actions that we are going to talk about here. So again, whatever trigger you decide to use, a timer trigger, the sync completed on the base, or just for my example, a button, you just have two actions to call. On your collection, you want to add a filter on both the start date and the end date. And basically you want the start date to be less or equal than today, that's the clock, I'm going to come back to that, and you want the end date to be greater than or equal to today, which said otherwise you want today to be between the start and the end. How do you get today? To get this value here, I'm using the ISO date time from the clock. The only thing you need to do in your experience is to make sure that you have the clock added here from within the interface assets. This is off the shelf. So to recap, you need a clock to know which day you are. You need the base and the fields to filter, and you need to apply a filter to make sure today is between the start and the end. And that's about it. So it is not off the shelf, but it is, in my opinion, super simple to build a collection with validity dates and these start and end dates for content. Geoff, I see we do have already a couple of questions coming in the chat.
We do. People paying no attention to you because they're completely off topic. No, I'm kidding. Well, I mean, they're on the topic of the headless CMS. But
okay.
I can put my camera back on too. And what I've decided to do, by the way, is sometimes we get questions and they're relevant for everybody. And so when I respond to them, I make sure everybody can see the response. I imagine we'll get the occasional question. It's about a particular project, and then I'll do a private answer. But these I did publicly answer. The first question was about headless CMS access. And, this is a bigger question, right? So the headless CMS launched in September. We have current gen player, next gen player. How does everything work together? When can I get access to it? And it's totally true. For current gen player, you can only use Windows. If you're using current generation player, an Android or iOS, you're not working with the headless CMS. For the next gen player, it's actually available on all the platforms. Every single platform PLN runs on, you can work with the headless CMS, but in that case, not everybody has access to the next gen player yet. So we recognize that we're kind of in some muddy waters right now, which over time will obviously clean themselves up. But so right now for current gen player, it's Windows or nothing. For next gen player, it's anything you want, but you got to get your hands on next gen player, which right now, as I recall, Seb is on a
managed
an account by account basis, where so people say I want to be able to use it, and then they go through a process. We evaluate and decide if they can. We had another question, which was, I wasn't exactly sure about the question. It was, is it brandable? But then there was a question about base access. So just a reminder, we do enable you to control user access rights for a given base. You can determine which people have access to which bases, and even control whether or not they can modify the data structure, modify the content, modify both. And that's what Seb is showing you on screen. You can see the list of accounts. Each of these people in the center there is an account, and they have a unique level of access to a base. But that's base level access. You cannot say only this collection. Can't do that. It's either they have access to all of it or none of it. So,
Yes.
And
that's an important point. I know, Louis, what you have in mind here. And you're right. There are some projects where you would like a store manager to be able to modify one collection, but not other collections, and a different store manager to be able to modify his data. This is on the roadmap, definitely coming. I don't have a date yet, so don't ask that question. As of today, what I've seen, and I'm not saying it's always possible depending on the volume of locations you have, but a solution, temporary solution, can be to create multiple bases, and then to give access to a base to the person who's supposed to modify that content, and then use these multiple bases in your one experience. That's something you can do. Talking about the rights, I just showed that here. Geoff, I added him to my base, but only gave him access to the content, meaning he cannot mess with my structure, he cannot invite additional people, and he cannot even use the base in one of his experiences. He can just go into this content tab and basically fill in the words, the text, and the images, and change the dates maybe. Eventually, we'll have much more role-based access views on here, and where people will be able to only modify a certain set of the content, some certain variations of the content, like the locations, for example, but we are not there yet.
Correct. And I know somebody must already be thinking, if I have multiple bases, can I duplicate a base? Not yet, but we know, and we might not be too far from enabling you to do that. One last question, Seb, and then we'll respect the agenda, which was hour, minute, second scheduling. So you showed date scheduling. What about hour, minute, second?
Yes. So actually, if you look into these two fields here, the start date and end date, I did include a time field. I think that's the setting by default, but if it's not checked, you can just check this this box here. And then when you go into the content, you can say actually this one, when you pick the date, then you pick the time. So this one, I want it only from starting at 6 a.m. and I want it to end on this date, maybe at 8 p.m., for example. So yes, you can do that. I have to say I didn't test the filter, but because we have the date and time in the ISO format from the clock, I'm expecting this will work as it should and will filter based on the date and the time within the player.
Yes. Yes. There was just a question. See, this is going to be the trick. How many questions do we answer before we got to move on?
Yeah.
Frank, we'll get back to that question. I want to give Seb the table for the next item, and then, but I'll flag your question. We'll come back to that because it's applicable across multiple topics. So, Seb, thank you for that. The next item on the agenda, it's another question that we've had since I joined the company 10 years ago, which is building wayfinding with Intuiface. Now that we have the headless CMS, it adds a new wrinkle to that. And so how would one create wayfinding with Intuiface and with the headless CMS?
Yeah. So first of all, this could be a complete webinar, and I have 4 minutes on this topic, I think. So I'm going to try to keep it short. You might recognize the sample that we have on the marketplace. It's actually 90% exactly the same thing, except we are not using Excel, we're using the headless CMS now behind the scenes. And because we've been asked that for a while, how can you draw the line from your here to your target? So no, we still don't have an engine that will compute that automatically based on the navigation graph and shortest path, things like that. We still don't do that. That's not what Intuiface is. But we've seen a lot of customers doing it. So we took some time ourselves to understand how they did it and how much time does it take to build these things. So 2 levels of wayfindings. Level number 1, which is the one we had already. When you click on an object, you select maybe from the category, the search, whatever. It just highlights the location. That's the simple wayfinding, which we've been doing so far. Next level, when you click on an item, you have a path which is being drawn to that location, to that point of interest. So I can click on this one. We did a few here on the map. We didn't do all of them yet. Was more like a proof of concept to show how you could do that. And guess what? It's an animated GIF. That's it. And we've seen people building these layers of transparent GIFs with the animation from A to B. I will actually paste a link into the chat, GIF tutorial here, which is the one of our graphic designers used. And she told me that now that she knows how to do that thing, it takes less than 5 minutes to create one path. And I'm pretty sure that the more you have to do, the less time it takes because you get your kind of a routine to build these objects. Now, how do you make this work in the experience, right? So let's go back to our CMS. We'll switch to the base for the Wayfinder. Same thing, we're going to have a look at the data first. And the data is basically the point of interest, so the shop. What category does it belong to? Is it jewelry, sports, things like that? What floor, if you have multiple floors in your plan? X and Y, these are the 2 important coordinates. This will be the position in pixels on your map, on your floor plan, because here we are not talking about wayfinding using Google Maps or Bing Maps, using latitude and longitude. We're talking about a flat image used as a background, which has a certain width and height in pixels. And the X and Y will be the position on top of this image. I will take an example back in Composer. Description, blah, blah, blah. And then we have the image, which is probably the logo of the store, and this path animated image, which is new, which is where we're going to add the animated GIF. Looking at the content, these are a couple of examples. And just remember that in this sample, our background image, the floor plan itself, is 1000 pixels per 1000 pixels. It's a square. So when you see, for example, this one, 573, 338, X and Y, it means that it should be, of course, on the second floor. Where is that thing? It should be somewhere in the middle and somewhere at the top. But that's basically 500, 500 will be at the center here. So this is how we will position the objects. 0, 0 is on the top left, 1000, 1000 is the bottom right, and then this is how you manage to get your X and Y coordinates. And then for those where we did the path, like this one, the Flipbug, we just added this animated GIF. And basically what we have as a trigger, when I click an object, again, we know in which data we are, in which set of data we are from the base, so we can show a placeholder. Let me go back to edit mode again to show you that. So we have our map, we have our group where we have the backgrounds. There's the animated path, which is a placeholder. We don't put all of them and decide which one we're going to show. It's just one, which is hidden by default. You can see that by default, that's the first one we have here. And then when we click on one of the objects, on one of the pinpoints, let me open this list of actions. We do quite a few things. Oh, there we go. Is tapped. All right, so if we do have a GIF, then we change the image of this placeholder here using our last field, the path animated image that we added to our base, and then we show the GIF. That's it. So again, you can have 50 items, 200 items. That's still two actions here, changing the image on the fly and then showing that image, and you're good to go. I was talking about the X and Y just to illustrate that as well. If you look at, we have a group here which has the data feed, so it's a collection. If I wanted to really mess my project around, I could show you this, switching to an asset grid. That's yet a collection. So now I have a collection of pinpoints, which is completely useless. But in the end, a group is a collection. You can have a data feed in a collection. And what makes the pinpoint go into the right position is that we have this X and Y of the group, the data template itself, bound to the X and Y we set up in the CMS. So that's how, if I were to remove this binding, for example, now we have everything on the same Y, which is a Y0. By adding the Y binding, now they go into their proper location on the map, again, using their parent as the reference. So again, 0, 0 being on the top left, because we wanted things simple here, 1000, 1000 being the bottom right. I think that covers all the basics about wayfinding, how to create a map with point of interests, and the new little tip about adding these animated paths using animated GIFs. They were created with After Effects, again, less than 5 minutes. I put the tutorial link in the chat. And before, I haven't seen the questions, but before you ask, no, we still don't have the SVG asset. Yes, it is still in the roadmap. So that question is covered. Geoff, I'll switch back to you. Let me know what else I missed in the chat.
I deleted all the questions about vectors. No, I'm kidding. We didn't have any questions. We did have an audience member, Ahmed, suggested an alternative for the animated diff creation, so I shared that with folks. You know, this particular exercise illustrates a general point about Intuiface, is it is a general purpose software platform. It is built with the flexibility to create whatever you want, but it also means it doesn't necessarily have built-in, the wayfinding building plugin. You know, that's not how it works. It's learning how to take the building blocks and to create visuals that, again, your audience doesn't know what you use. They don't know it's Intuiface. They don't know if you have animated. All they know is that if I touch a point of interest, now they're getting a path. And so there's a little bit of upfront work, and then it should be run happily and autonomously. Thank you, Ahmed.
Let me comment on that, because Ahmed has actually a good suggestion. The animated GIF is one option. There might be another one using SVG, and that's true. I said that we don't have an SVG asset, but we do have the HTML frame. So one might use the HTML frame like this, put it on top, And then instead of having HTML here, could use some SVG code and just change the SVG on the fly coming from the CMS. That might work. It was easier for me to ask the graphic designer to build a GIF than to build an animated SVG. So it depends on your resources, on your skills, and what you have available. I would definitely give that solution a try. And if Ahmed says it works, I'm pretty sure it does.
Great. All right, Seb. Louis, I see your question. We'll get back to that at the end. So let's move on. Thank you very much. QR codes. So we all know what that was, and I don't think I'm making this up, but 3-4 years ago, I think people thought QR codes were dead, weren't being used that much, and then along comes COVID, and now they are everywhere. If for no other reason, because it enables you to not touch stuff, but take things with you on your personal device. We do have a facility for creating QR codes under certain circumstances, natively. Under other circumstances, you need to go outside Intuiface to generate those QR codes. So in this session, Seb is going to help you understand the process of generating QR codes based on the platform and based on your needs. Go ahead, Seb.
Thank you, Geoff. So yeah, we do have multiple ways of creating QR codes, and I'm just going to show 2 ways here. That doesn't mean these are the only ones. Way number 1, which is the oldest one, the legacy one, which was built for Windows, it is using our QR code generator interface set, which is written in .NET and which runs offline. So if you were, for example, on a trade show where you had a local base of content using an Excel file and you wanted to generate on the fly these QR codes on a Windows machine, on a player for Windows, that would be a good option. So how do you use that? This IA has one read-write property, which is the text to encode. This is where you actually type in your address. So if I change that, we will see that this code just changed here on my screen. And then you have a read-only property, which is a file path to a PNG image generated on the fly. So to display that image, you basically need to add an image asset and bind it to this generated QR code path, and that's it. You're good to go. And version 1.b of this one is to actually use a converter, because depending on the length of your URL, and I'm going to go in play mode here to illustrate that, the QR code might get complex. So instead of encoding, let me go to, I don't know what I have. Let me try to find, okay, this URL here. And it's maybe not that obvious here, but what I did, I have a trigger. Each time the URL changes on my web browser, it updates the QR code here. So at the top here, if you scan this code, you will get this full URL, intuiface.com/services-bootstrap. If you scan the one at the bottom, you will get a tiny URL, which would be very shorter. If you had a much longer URL than this, I'm not sure how I can generate that on a website, you would see a very complex code at the top and a much simpler one at the bottom, which makes it a bit simpler to scan. So that's on the Windows side. And by the way, the tiny URL, you do need to be online, so you lose a little bit the advantage of the .NET interface set. Option number 2, which will work on all the platforms, including Windows, including our current generation of player for Android, iOS, and our next generation of player, use a third-party API. I'm using an example here, which is a free one you can find on the web, qrserver.com. And basically, the API works like this. You have a URL in which you can add some parameters. I would invite you to go to the qrserver.com website and look at the documentation. And you can even put colors, background colors, foreground colors. It's a pretty cool API. And then at the end, you add the end data equals, and that's where you put your URL. So to make this working in Interface, it's not an IA per se. You don't need an interface asset. You need an image asset. You need to bind it on your URL. In my case, I'm using the current URL property of my web browser. So each time my browser moves to a different page, this is updated live, and that's my binding. And because I don't want an image to show a URL, I have a converter, which is just a concatenate. So basically, I am concatenating the URL I put here before the binding input, which is the actual URL of the web browser. So if actually, let me show you another example here. Basically, this image is bound to this URL, to which I concatenate this API, but now this doesn't make sense. I need the API to go before the URL. And now that's the full URL. If you copy this and paste it in your browser, you will get an image as a response. It's not a JSON or an XML, it's a pure binary image coming out of this API, which is why you can bind directly the image asset to that API result. That's the second solution. Now, all these two methods, or at least the one with the interface set, they are pretty good when you need one QR code at a time. So if you had a collection of items, you click on one, you display the QR code, you close it, you click on another object, you show another QR code, that works. What if you need a list of QR codes? Don't ask me what use case would use that, but let's imagine. So I have another example here, which is getting the data from a headless CMS base, which is this World Wonders. If I look at my data, among my wonders, I have the name, I have a picture, the photo, and then I have a URL to the Wikipedia page. Well, in the collection itself, I can have my image asset bound to the URL coming from our base. So same thing I did with the web browser, except this one is static. It's not changing every time I click on something. And then adding the same converter with whatever parameter I want. And you can see this Wikipedia URL is pretty long. That's why you get a pretty complex QR code, which is where maybe going through a first step to tiny URL it might help to get a simpler one. But at least you can see that with this binding mechanism on the third-party API, you can create QR codes within a collection, within a data template. That's what I wanted to illustrate here. The different use cases, one QR code or multiple QR codes in a collection, Windows only, or all the platforms we support using this API method, and basically just an image asset. All right, that's it for me. Any questions on that topic?
Didn't see any questions, but I do want to revisit, just to be clear, the one advantage of the Windows interface asset is you can be offline. Everything else you discussed, you have to be online, correct?
That's correct. The other advantage is that we created this one X years ago. I won't say the X because I don't remember. But that was before we even had the notion of converters, I believe, in Intuiface. So that's also an advantage. It was here before. It's kind of a legacy one now, but it does work offline.
No other questions, but when you brought up this notion of a collection of QR codes, it kind of brings us to the next topic, which is pop-ups, where you can bring up information about something in the context of a particular interaction. And like many things like wayfinding, it's not like we have a pop-up plugin, but there's absolutely ways to build it, and Seb has put together a good method for doing that. So Seb, why don't you go ahead for pop-ups?
Yeah, and when I look at the list of attendees, I see a lot of advanced users. So you all know how to create these pop-ups, at least all of you guys. There are a few that I don't know, so just in case. The first thing I want to remember is if you're trying to do something in Composer and you have a doubt, the black box here, search online documentation. If I type in pop-up, it will bring me to the help center, and look at that. First result, how to create a pop-up. So that's actually the article and the steps I'm using. There's a 1.5-minute video, step-by-step list of actions, things to do to create a pop-up in Intuiface. So that's always a good resource to check. And then you can ask us on support, of course. The mechanism of a pop-up is super simple. You have a collection with a summary view of your content, and then you want to open something with a more detailed view. This something, in that case, great design, right, is just a group, as in a group collection, in which I added a background, could be maybe a bit transparent so we can keep the context of what's behind, and then whatever kind of data we want. And I'm reusing the QR code example here, as Geoff mentioned. Then the question is, but I have 8 items in my list. Do I need 8 pop-ups? And I'm addressing this because I've seen this question a lot coming on support, and that's completely normal. People not being used to the notion of data source and data template as they work in Intuiface. They might think about doing 8 pop-ups, and if I click on button 1, showing pop-up number 1. If I click on button 2, showing pop-up number 2, which can work to an extent if you have 2, 3, 5 items maybe. I like to say that 5 is my threshold where I stop doing copy and paste and I start thinking data. What kind of data source do I need to make this more generic? So if I have 6 today, but tomorrow the customer wants 20, I have nothing else to do. It's already ready and up and working. So with this in mind, you basically create one pop-up that you consider as a placeholder. Then from your template, you need to do a few things. You need to dynamically fill in that pop-up. So put the correct data in the placeholder. So on this text here, I want to set the text and I want to use the text from my data source because I am in the data template at the moment. So this Great Pyramid of Giza, I want to put that text into the text asset that I have in the pop-up. I want to do the same thing with the image. I want to open the proper URL in the web browser. And look at that. I want to encode my Wikipedia entry URL into a QR code so that the image, which is bound to my QR code interface asset, I'm using the Windows.NET version here, will be up to date. And then at the end, when all of this is done, I'll actually want to show the pop-up. So these are pretty simple steps. So there's no animation on changing a text, changing an image, opening a URL. So I don't have any timing here. Depending on the amount of data or maybe some loading time, you might want to delay this show a little bit or have a kind of a loading indicator, depending, again, if you're loading a huge 3D model for industry objects, you might want to consider that in the way you're building the pop-up and showing that pop-up. But in a simple sample like this, I'm just going to hit play. And pretty sure you already have an idea of the result. But I think we also have a color for each items in our base. So if I click on the pyramid, I get a reddish background. I need some transparency, so now it's a bit weird. With the proper image, the proper Wikipedia page, and if you scan that code, you will get to that web page. If I close the pop-up and show another one, I have the Hoover Dam. I could see, I don't know with the screen share, that the web page took maybe half a second or a few tenths of seconds to load the new URL. So again, that depends on your bandwidth, on the kind of content you're loading. This close button actually is basically just doing a hide of the group, which I'm using as a pop-up. I'm calling the pop-up a group. The group is a pop-up. I'm using a group as a pop-up in this particular case. And let me look at my notes. I think, yeah, that's the QR code. That's the pop-up. Just for the sake of organizing my content, I like to put this in a different layer. You want to make sure that the pop-up is on top of your main content. So if I had the pop-up here below in the layer, that would look awful because I would have the collection on top. That wouldn't make sense. And then I used an animation property here. When I'm showing that pop-up, I changed the fade into a fade and zoom just because you can. Why not? And so this show pop-up with an animation, you do exactly the opposite from this close button here. It is doing only one thing, hiding the pop-up. You don't need to reset the image to a placeholder value. You don't need to do that. You just need to hide that thing until another object from the data source will change these placeholders and then show the pop-up again. Geoff, I think that covers the pop-up. Any questions on that?
You showed the Hoover Dam, and you're practically working near the Hoover Dam, aren't you? No, I guess you're in Colorado.
Yeah, in November. November, I'll be next to Hoover Dam.
The next quarterly event will be from the Hoover Dam. I like that you showed in the animation that you have the ability to control when you display the pop-up. I think it's a really important bit of input. That what you can actually do, in fact, tell me if I'm wrong, as part of the animation is to show a loading indicator that you just preset to a certain amount of time and then transition to showing the actual thing you wanted to show. So you're sort of programmatically forcing the loading indicator, anticipating there might be a little bit of a delay, and then you show the actual thing, right?
That's correct. And you could even go more fancy with animations, like working on a prototype right now where you show a rectangle of the same color covering the object and then expanding across the whole screen, and then the things arriving with animations one by one. So yeah, you can get pretty creative. You don't have to be brutal like I was here. That's why we have designers in our teams, and I'm not one of them. And making sure that maybe in the pop-up, these objects are not visible and they appear one by one with some kind of timing, or they fly in from the edge, or whatever kind of animation you want to do.
It's a really good sort of secondary bit of education there on the pop-up. That was, I'm glad we saw that. We have one last item on the agenda. We're switching gears. So we're moving into the world of analytics. When we first released anything around analytics, which was 5 years ago now, 6 years ago, you can define the data you wanted to collect, and then you can export, you can grab the data and put it into something else. About 3-4 years ago, we introduced our own charts and dashboards capability, which hopefully all of you are quite familiar with. We wanted to revisit this idea of accessing data, but we're doing it in the context of non-analytics data, because that's sort of an interesting wrinkle. Typically, when you use analytics, you're thinking, I want to make a chart. But that's not the only reason to use analytics. And you can use analytics to just collect form data. You're not going to graph it. You're probably not using Intuiface's charts and dashboards feature, but you need to access the data for some reason. And form data is sort of the classic. Maybe it's a trade show, maybe it's a museum, who knows? So this is about working with user data, form data. How do you collect it and how do you access it? Good, Seb.
Yeah, and again, that's one question which I grabbed from the support tickets that I've been seeing over the last month. And maybe it's because on the way we've been communicating on the analytics, focusing that much on the charts and dashboards, which are great and a great tool. But what about if you want to collect a list of email of people visiting your booth on a trade show again? A chart is not adapted to that. You don't want to create a dashboard with a big table, which wouldn't be very usable. You want to get the list of CSV or Excel and send it to your marketing team so they can mass email the visitors and add them to your CRM. So I just wanted to, take a step back and remind all of you that when you go into your My Interface dashboard, you have actually two analytics entry points. You have the analytics dashboards, which again, we focused on, so we put it quite at the top of the list here, which is where you will access the charts and dashboards we've been talking about. But then below you have the analytics data. And as Geoff mentioned, that's what we had first. We had that before having the charts and dashboards. And without the data, there wouldn't be any charts and dashboards. So when you collect that data, this text data that you want to actually process, not in a chart, the really easiest way to do that is to go into Excel, select your time frame. I'm actually going to keep the month because I did a test last week, so we should see both of them. And then download that data points, that list of data points. I'm going to open this, and now it's just an Excel thing. So this will contain some data from on my machine from the last month. So the first thing I want to do is go into filter and make sure I look only at the QA experience. And as you can see, well, I did some tests in the wayfinding scene. I clicked on some objects. I played with the dates. I did quite a bunch of things, right? But if I filter again on my events and I select only my contact form event, then if I go on the right, I have two events, a test comment, which if you look at the date was from last week, and the one which I wrote right now while Geoff was talking. So basically doing these two filters, it was what, 4 or 5 clicks in Excel. And that's the list you need to export and to send to your marketing team so they can gather these email addresses and put them in the HubSpot, Outreach, whatever ActiveCampaign kind of software they want to use for post-event marketing activities. So accessing this data can be useful for two things, in my opinion. One is the scenario I just described. You don't want to show this data in a chart. You want to use it in another tool like a CRM, and you want to process the data. Two is you actually want to create some charts. If I remove my filters, and I look at the kind of events that I have, let me just focus on the QA. If I look at all these events, okay, I have some item viewed and item selected. Actually, I'm not sure why I have a difference. And that's one is in the wayfinding, one is in the pop-ups. Okay, I actually wanted to know which point of interest were the most consulted in the wayfinding. Okay, that's the event I need to look for. So by looking at the raw data, I have an idea about what was logged in the experience, what was made in Composer. So I know in my chart builder what parameter I need to look at. And what I need to use when I want to build my chart. So this is pretty useful even if you want to use the charts and dashboards. The last thing I want to say is Excel is one way, and it's to me the simplest way. But if you want to automate that or maybe create a live integration with the CRM, we also have a REST API. So you could access this data weekly, monthly, depending on your use case, download the data through the API, and then have some script that will process it and will import it into your CRM. You can create that connector yourself if you have the development skills or resources in-house to do that. So mentioning that we do have an API can be useful if you want to automate that process, and it's not just a couple of trade shows a year that we are talking about. I think that covers the analytics, and we are, I'm late on the timing.
You're not late. It's perfect. Yeah, the REST API is sort of the general purpose means for extracting the data. Pretty much any other platform that manages data, it very likely enables you to pull in data through a REST API. So if you want to automate, that might be the way to go. Very good. So Seb, we do have some tabled questions. Here's what I'll say. First of all, not everybody can stick around maybe, so let me be very clear right now that Player Next Gen is available for companies who are ready to give it a spin. You need to send us an email, send your sales rep an email, let somebody know that you want to get your hands on the next gen of Player, and we'll assess your needs and what you want to do. And if all is good, we'll get you access to it, not just for running on Android and iOS and Chrome, Brightside, but also for web deployment, for example. You can start doing that as well. So if any of you are interested in using Player Next Gen, please do that. Seb, thank you very much, because that was one of the questions. We have documented the limitations. Go ahead, Seb.
Yeah, so Louis, I just answered you. I put the link publicly in the chat. What is working today in PLN? Sorry, Player Next Gen, PLN inside name. What is not working yet, what will never be supported, like Microsoft Deep Zoom, which by the way Microsoft abandoned, so we are not doing to support that anyways. That's the page. We are updating this page on a regular basis. 8 days ago in this case for this one. Pretty sure there might be another update coming soon on the page. So yeah, check this one if you want to have a look. And I would say ask us also, because even if you're keeping the page up to date, depending on your needs, depending on the project you're working on, the list might fluctuate a little bit. So we are open to hear what you are willing to do to build with the Player Next Gen.
And so this also brings us to Frank's question from much earlier, which was, if I build it for Windows or Android, for example, using current gen, will it run without me having to do anything when I use next gen? And the answer is, in theory, 100% absolutely. The issue are the limitations, right? So
that's correct.
There might be existing limitations that will constrain what you can do in next gen, even though you could do it in current gen. The plan, of course, is 100% of current gen will work in next gen. You don't have to touch anything in Composer. That's the goal. But limitations might put some constraints on that. So you need to make sure you're familiar with those limitations so there's no surprise.
Yeah. And actually, I'm a bit playing with fire here, but I just switched my Composer to Player Next Gen, getting the data from the HCMS. Yeah, maybe some converters are not supported yet, and probably my bandwidth is cramming, but the filters are working. So I should get the data. Yeah, here comes the data. So filters are working. I use some weird converters here to display the data, so that's why you see text instead. But yeah, most of the things would work. That's PLN, that's Player Next Gen running, so the objects are positioned properly. The GIF works, maybe a bit of offset, so minor things to tweak. And to do that, the only thing I did was to go in my Composer, switch to the Player Next Gen because I have access to it, So again, that's something that if you're interested in, if you have some projects needing a player next gen, contact us. We'll talk about that. Frank, just one minor thing for you, because I know your projects. There's one thing that will not work in player next gen, and these are interface assets written in JavaScript. They will have to be converted to TypeScript. We have a bit of a different mechanism to build interface assets for player next gen, which is much, much, much better. I actually did a quick video on that, which was shown by Vincent during the user conference. It's not available yet for users to build these interface assets in TypeScript. That should be coming soon. I don't have the date, but that will be maybe for your projects. If you have custom JavaScript interface assets, the small limiting point at the moment.
Look, at the end of the day, the limitations list exists so that we can take things off it, right? So let's just be very clear. Limitations are things we know that exist and need to be dealt with. They're not things that will live forever. Seb, your example here actually dovetails with another question we received, which was knowing when filtering is done or knowing when the processing is finished. This is Alex's question. If you take a look.
Yeah, I'm looking. I'm reading it. It's a good question. I don't think we have any trigger about filters.
The question is, can I know when filtering is done so I can do it off screen, and when it's ready, I can bring it on screen so you're not seeing it kind of load progressively? That was the question.
I completely see the point and the reason for that. I will say that we never had the trigger for Excel, and we basically reproduce the kind of the same mechanisms with the headless CMS, knowing that all the filters with the headless CMS are applied locally on the client side. There's no back and forth API stuff going with the Intuiface Cloud. Everything is local, so it should be pretty fast. And my understanding is that what takes time is not the filtering per se. Filtering the data is pretty quick. It's refreshing the visuals. If you have a collection, for example, of 50 items and you go down to 20, you need to reorganize to the layout and to refresh basically how the collection is painted on the screen. That's what takes time more than the filter itself, unless you're running on an Atom CPU. So it's a good point. I would say probably the best place would be to go into the wish list in community and add that, add that as a suggestion. Maybe that could be a new set of triggers, which most of the case might be pretty quick between filter started, filter completed. But why not? I see the need. So yeah, that would be a good place for the wish list.
There was a related question about binding to a filter data source versus. Yep.
Yeah, I can explain this one. So the question is, for this mechanism here of the detail group pop-up, question is, do you recommend to set each item, which is what I did here by using this button, which does a set like this, versus binding the objects to the data, which would be in this pop-up here, having, for example, this image bound to Wonder's image like this, and then filtering the collection to the one item. So now that I read and explained the question, what would I recommend between using what I did here, which is setting each items, showing the group, versus binding these items to the item number one and then filtering the data source? I would say 80% of the time I would recommend what I did here for two reasons. Number one is, if I were applying a filter, this list would move, would change visually, and I would not keep the context. So I would go from 8 items to 1, show the pop-up, close the pop-up, go from 1 item back to 8. If I want to keep this collection visible on the side, so let's say my pop-up, for example, was, let me check that, was like this, and my collection was like this. With my current solution, without the filters, that works. I can Oh, I stayed in PELN. Maybe not the best example because we don't have the web browsers. Anyways, besides the web browser, which we don't have, and you can see that I can click on the objects. My list on the left is not filtered. My text, rectangle color, and image is switching super quickly. And so that's reason number one. Being able to keep the context of the whole collection without reducing the collection to one, expanding it back, reducing to one, expanding it back. The second reason, as you can imagine, is performance. Because if you are applying that filter, you are applying it twice. Once to reduce the list to one item, so you are repainting the collection from 8 items to 1, refreshing the binding, showing the result of the bindings, and then when you hit the close button, you need to clear that filter to recover your whole collection, going back from 1 item back to 8. So that's twice the amount of work for the CPU. So that's why the filters, I would not do that unless you go to a different scene, and then it doesn't matter that much. It might make it simpler to
bottom
go.
line, Alex. Bottom line, Alex, there was a terrible idea, is what Seb was saying. I'm gonna net that out.
I've been doing it myself in some of the webinars I did with Excel, and in some projects that we have, like the DIY browsing catalog, like some burger examples. When you navigate from one scene to another, it's usually simpler to use the filters. That makes complete sense. The two techniques are valid. In this case, and particularly in the case of a pop-up means you stay in the same scene. If you stay in the same scene, it's probably because you want to be able to go back super quickly to the background layer, to the collection. And to be able to have a quick navigation from back to front, from the collection to the pop-up, the filter is not the thing I would introduce here.
We are going to start wrapping this up. We encourage you, we will probably eventually set up a formal mechanism for submitting questions. Now, this is something we recognize internally. Let's say you submit a good question tomorrow. Do we wait 3 months to answer it? No, we shouldn't be doing that, right? So the point of the quarterly is sort of a wrap up of the previous 3 quarters, getting some highlights. If you're on the community, we're going to stay active every day for the next 3 months. We're not going to table questions and make you wait for that answer. But if you do have questions, please submit them. We'll answer them as soon as we can, but we might want to bring them back to the quarterly, which will be recorded. We're going to have a page where we'll put these recordings and make them available to you. There was one other question, Seb, and it's a good one, of course, which is if we know what's coming next for Player Next Gen, we'll try to do that in the community as well. That's where we like to communicate this sort of insider stuff. If we know that something is coming soon, we'll give you guys a heads up. And of course, we'll modify the limitations page as well, which I don't know, now that I think about it, maybe there should be sort of a change log on the limitations page. I don't know, sort of at the top what's been taken off the list. I want to thank everybody for coming to this inaugural session. We're going to do it, as I said, every 3 quarters. So the next one is July, August, maybe September. I don't know if we have a date yet. We have to figure that out, Seb. But, thank you, everyone, for joining. We will post the results. Please give us any feedback you have. And as I said, we'll answer your questions every time we get them, but maybe we'll find some really awesome ones we can highlight the next time together. So thank you, everyone, for joining. Seb, thank you as well for your hard work. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Geoff, for the questions. And yeah, thanks everyone for being here. It's a good feedback for us. If you want to send us any feedback about the session as well, if you want to see different things, different ways of presenting, let us know. Let us know. We'll be happy to get your feedback on the session as well.
We're learning. We should do a Q&A about the Q&A. That's what we should do. All right, guys. Thank you so much. Have a good rest of the week. Take care.
Have a good day, evening, night. Bye-bye.
Bye.